we're going to be talking primarily about how to do electrical connections with all the things that we want to do today with energy storage, backup power, and all that. So there's a couple really big things happening in our world today related to how we integrate these systems. Certainly AC coupling is a big one. And Tesla was one of the first to market with that, if you don't count Sunny Island 25 years ago, but let's not talk about that. They made it popular and famous, and they have a MID as well. And so we're going to talk about microgrid interconnect devices. And so as we put all these things together, we have rules that go way back. The 120% rule, everybody likes to call it the 120% rule. It's the one rule that most AHJs actually know. And so because they know it, that's their hammer, right? And everything looks like a nail. And so if it doesn't fit that rule, they don't know what to do about it. And so back around the 2014 code, we tried it in the 2011 code, but in the 2014 code, I was involved in rewriting all the rules related to load side connections. And we put some things in there that we knew were going to be a big deal. And so we're going to go into how do we do these things today. And there's two things that are essentially off the list when we're talking about AC coupling and batteries. The first one is line side taps, or what people call line side taps. The correct term would be a supply side connection to a service, okay? So we could have a source connection to a service, which is what it's termed now in the 2023 code. But that does us no good with the battery storage system unless all we're going to do is energy arbitration. And energy arbitrage is just it's almost a ridiculous thing to do in this day and age, because if you can't use the batteries for backup, really, all we're talking about is a financial thing, and I don't really have a lot of interest in that. Okay, so in the new code, we talk about DC interconnected systems. This would be an old school multi-mode inverter where the MID, we used to just say there's a relay inside there for isolating the grid, but the MID would be inside the machine, and there's probably 20 different machines out here on the floor that do that kind of stuff. However, what we're dealing with is much more along this line, an AC coupled system where we have an MID, we might have PV system coming into it and things like that. And so we're going to get into those kind of details. We get into these more involved. We have a microgrid interconnect device. We've got some kind of energy storage multi-mode inverter. This is the diagram that I wrote for the 2023 code. So this is what's in there. This is not a Franklin diagram or anything like that. It's just, that's the code. And so, we have multi-mode inverters, and the whole idea behind a multi-mode inverter is you're shifting the inverter between two modes: current mode when you're connected to the grid, and voltage mode when you're disconnected from the grid. All other inverters have to follow the voltage mode inverter when you're in backup mode. So you could have microinverters, multiple inverters with different power sources connected into that. So microgrid interconnect device, that's a device that isolates and reconnects to the grid. And so all the rules around that, they're very new. The standards for this stuff are brand new. And so the only listed devices we have for this purpose are in residential right now. And so if you want to do a commercial microgrid, it's going to be a cobbled together system. It's not going to be a listed system. I'd say Schneider has a listed system in the commercial world, and that's about it. Everything else is residential right now, but there'll be products coming out on that. So we're starting to make the term microgrid as a common term, both in residential, commercial, even though it applies to much larger microgrids. There might even be a downtown of an urban community could be a microgrid. So that term is a very, very broad term used in a lot of different ways. Here's what I would consider much more cobbled together microgrid interconnect device with very, very complex. And if it breaks, good luck fixing that. Anyway, supply side connections, this is what we're going to talk about. And this is the extent of it. Hooking stuff into that's never going to happen again. We're just not going to do it that way anymore. So forget all the rules about supply side connections unless you're doing large commercial systems, and that's the only way you can do it. If it's got batteries, it's not going to be connected in the supply side. So everything's going to be load side. So this was often termed the Hawaiian tie-in. Somebody made up that term, not me, but I'm the one that came up with the idea behind this, and then it got this great name, Hawaiian tie-in. And the idea there is that in Hawaii, we have a lot of meter mains. So you got a meter on the outside of the house, main breaker, and then that goes to a sub panel in the house. And everybody's like, well, I don't want to have to go into the house and make my connections in there. That's going to be a pain. So I said, okay, well, let's just tie in right after that 100 amp breaker, put another 100 amp breaker downstream of that, and you can go all the way up to 100 amps all day long. There are literally thousands and thousands of these systems in Hawaii set up just like that. And we can go as large as we want. So everybody said, well, anything over 40 amps on a 200 amp service, I have to do a supply side connection. That is absolutely wrong. It's never been true, but it's certainly not true right now. And we've always had this kind of an option to do that. Well, what if you don't have a meter main? Well, there's the old school 120% rule. You can put a 3.8 kilowatt PV system on that 100 amp service, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Now all your transaction costs, how much money are you going to make on that job? Probably not a lot. So there's, everybody knows that, but the real important one is the third option that we have in 705.12, which is on bus bars, which is the sum of the ampere ratings of the overcurrent devices connected to the panel board minus the main supply breaker are not greater than the panel board bus bar rating. And that's a lot of words just to say that you're protecting the bus bar by saying that it's physically impossible to move more than the rating of the panel in or out of the panel, because the breakers that are on the branch circuit breakers that are connected to the bus bar don't exceed the rating of the panel. It was intended to be a very simple thing. It's like, how much of them are source and how much are loads? We don't care. This is super simple. But it does matter. Yes, it does matter. We're trying to do something very simple, especially for the HJ, but even for the installer. I call it the take off your shoes, count your toes and fingers, and if you can do that, you can probably do this rule, and it'll work for you every time. And then we have a little sign that says what you have to put on there. Total rating of all overcurrent devices, excluding main supply, cannot exceed the ampacity of the bus bar. Now, when you get into three phase, it gets a little more complicated. We're not going to go into that, but let's just move on. So now, well, what if you have in California, we have a lot of exterior service panels, right? We have all-in-one panels. All-in-one panels have always been the bane of anybody that wanted to do a supply side connection, because you cannot legally connect on the supply side of an all-in-one panel. It's impossible. Okay? There's no legal way to do it. Now, people do it all the time. There's no legal way to do it. And so when it catches on fire, not if, when it catches on fire, you'll probably get in trouble and people will get mad at you. So let's say we have an outside panel and it's got a bunch of breakers in it. It looks like crap, whatever, even could have been made by Zinsco, all right? Everybody hates those things. I don't care. As long as the breakers are still good and in decent shape, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to physically remove all the breakers that are in there, and then I'm going to put in, and I like to use a 100 amp service, because most people, or a lot of folks, have 200 amp services, but the 100 amp services are particularly difficult to work with. And so let's talk about 100 amp service. So I'm going to rip everything out of there. There could be 10 or 15 breakers in that outdoor main panel. I'm going to rip them all out, and then I'm going to replace them all with one 100 amp breaker. And so this is just like a feed through system. I'm just feeding power through this panel. I'm getting away from this main service panel. Why is that? Well, because if I tried to change out this panel in the state of California right now, the utility company is going to come along and say, oh, we have a whole bunch of new regulations now. So it's not as simple as it used to be of saying, okay, I'm going to do a panel change out. Boom. $2,500, whatever it was, bam, you're done. It's not that easy anymore. Utility is going to get involved, and they're going to go, oh, by the way, we set our gas meter 2 feet away from the main meter, and our new rule says it must be 3 feet away from the main meter. It's your job to fix that. It's like, but I thought you installed this. And it's like, it doesn't matter. And so that is going to cause you plenty of problems. They're also going to argue about you're going to have to do a service upgrade on this system, because we buried, back in the 1960s, we buried conductors underground that are falling apart. We know this. And so anytime you start touching your main panel, we're going to call that a requirement for a service upgrade. And you're going to have to pay to put in all new service conductors to fix our mistake that we did a long time ago, because we don't want to have to pay for that, because we're paying for this little mishap that happened over in San Mateo where a bunch of people died and things blew up. You know, pay no attention, you know, to the guy behind the curtain kind of thing. So anyway, what this does is this gets us away from that main service disconnect. Keep the main service disconnect, the main service disconnect, move away from that. And now we put a 100 amp panel in there now, or 100 amp breaker in there. Now that we have the 100 amp breaker, we can do anything we want downstream of that. The only thing limiting us is the 100 amp circuit, but that's already limiting us, right? Because we have a 100 amp service. 100 amp service disconnecting means, so we can, by its very definition, we can never shove more than 100 amps back through that breaker anyway, whether you do a supply side connection or not. It makes no difference, it's the same thing. But I can come downstream and I can put in a 200 amp panel all day long. I can go down to Home Depot, do an indoor panel, outdoor panel, whatever you want. Costs maybe a couple $100, and then in that panel I can mix various energy storage, AC and PV in that panel. Okay, so this is very simple, taking things downstream. Again, we have to put this warning label on there, but now we're using the sum of the breakers in this panel, including this guy, is no more than 100% of the bus bar rating. Okay, there's different rules, because we're going to want to put, we could put up to 30 breakers, maybe even 40 breakers in this panel, do all of our breakers, maybe add breakers to this thing. We're under no limitations. We're not under this limitation if we're doing the 100% rules. 100 plus 50 plus 50, that's 200. Everybody got that? It's really, really difficult math, I know. But there you go. All right, so we talked about the MID and the inverter. Here's an example of the MID and the inverter. Again, you see a lot of those systems here. We're not going to go into detail on that. We could have an interconnection at the MID. Here's an example where you're coming directly off the meter base, and the main service disconnecting means is in the MID. And certainly the A-gate that Franklin has and the Gateway and other products out there have the ability to put the main breaker and make that the main service disconnecting means. That's great, but again, this situation does not get you around the PG&E problems. Okay? You are fundamentally changing that service, and they're going to bring all that stuff in to haunt you. So even though it's a possibility, and it's certainly absolutely good according to the code, think about all the other problems that you might have to deal with when you do that. Okay, it could be microinverters that you're bringing in, energy storage, so we can mix all this stuff in a separate subpanel. We could mix it in MID, what I like to call a multifunction MID enclosure. A multifunction MID enclosure, which the A-gate you'll see on the other side does, is not only does it have the MID in it, but it also has, it has the connections for the energy storage, for the photovoltaics, and all the rest in the same box. As well as, in this case, control breakers and stuff like that. Smart breakers. You should go around this exhibit hall and count how many times you see the word smart. It's a lot. We're going to have to start marketing dumb things. It's like, this is like solar for idiots or something like that. It's so easy. That's what we want. Anyway, here's an example where this is an AC coupled system where you could split. If this is, say, a 200 amp panel, you could split and go 100 amps this way and go to an MID, and take 100 amps this way and go into the backup panel. Well, why did I waste my time pulling all these loads out of here? I could have just left them in there. The answer is no, you can't. In 705.12, they won't let you do it that way. Okay, so we're trying to use the sum of the breakers rule. The sum of the breakers rule says 100 plus 100, you're already up to 200. So if you have a whole bunch of small breakers in there, that's going to jump, it's going to take you over 200. That's why if we're going to do it this way, we've got to pull it out and put it in a separate box. Now, from a physics point of view, does it make much difference? Probably not. So I don't want to have to do that. It's not fair. Man, just get over it. Okay, you want to do a service upgrade, have on at it. Go for it, man. I'm just trying to help you out here. This is what the code says. This works for you. It'll work every time. Putting in a new sub panel is not a big deal. Okay, it takes some labor. That's what we do, right? And so we put it in, and also, if it's an old Zinscope panel, now we've gotten rid of all these old crappy breakers, get them out of there, put them in a nice new panel. It's not going to fall apart, all that good stuff. So that's another way to do it. Could be a DC to DC converter system. I don't even know who makes those things. I've never heard of the companies. But anyway, I did see an exhibitor here said they had a DC optimizer, and I'm like, dude, you know that's like a trademark term, don't you? We make DC to DC converters unless they're a company called SolarEdge, and they make DC optimizers because that's a trademark term. And that's why we don't have the term in the code. We don't, everybody wants to talk about where's DC optimizers in the code. It's not in there, it's DC to DC converters. Power control systems. So, and this actually got a name change in the 2023 code. How are we doing on time? Good. So power control systems is the real game changer in all this. Now we've been talking about kind of brick and mortar ways of following the code to make sure you're in compliance. And we basically get away from that main service panel, we split things up. We can have backup loads, non-backup loads, we can have microgrid devices, we can have microgrid devices and inverters, all these different avenues of how to do that. But power control systems, I invented the term, and now we're just calling them energy management systems. Power control systems are a subset of energy management systems. Historically, energy management systems have only been load control. They've never done anything with power, all right? So it's always been about turning off equipment or turning down thermostats, turning up thermostats, doing those kinds of things, turning motors on and off, turning lighting on and off. That's been termed energy management systems, but it's really load management. So now we're really moving into Article 750 of the code, which is now actually dealing with sources as well as loads for the very first time in the 2023 code. And so it truly is energy management. So we're managing not only the energy we're using, but the energy we're producing. And so by doing that and actively doing that, and if we add the capability of monitoring the service conductors, we can control everything that's going on in this picture, and we don't have to rely on these 120% rule things, which were just kind of throwing things at stuff. And 100% rule, some of the breakers rules, none of those things really matter anymore in panels that are controlled. Now, in the panels that are not controlled, then we're going to have those things. We're going to have to follow those rules. But if we have control over the sources and the loads in our panel, we can, and we have a 200 amp panel, we can constrain the flow of current in that panel so it never exceeds the rating of the panel. Okay? And so that's really the basic concept behind it. And one of the reasons we have that concept is that, let's go back to the 100 amp service problem. 100 amp service is a very limiting service. What's kind of a new thing that's been coming on the market lately that uses a lot of electricity? Electric vehicles, okay? This is a massive load. This is by far the biggest load on any residential service. You think your air conditioner is a bigger load? No. In fact, if you look at the data on your air conditioner system versus the data on a consistently used EV, the EV blows it away. An electric vehicle will use as much energy as an entire house, one. That's a good rule of thumb, one electric vehicle. So now we're consuming way more electricity than we used to. And so the idea is if you have a 100 amp service and you want to put in a electric vehicle, boom, 200 amp service, thank you very much. 30 grand later, after you dug up all your power lines and did all the stuff, now you've got an electric vehicle. Not many people are going to do that if it's going to cost them 30 grand, right? So we have a huge barrier to adoption. So what we do is, wait a minute, what if we measured our service conductors? What's the average load on a 100 amp service house? Somewhere probably to 20 to 40 amps, all right? And so if we want to use a 32 amp charger, right, level 2 charger, most of the time it's actually going to be okay, but for the few times it won't be okay, Article 220 in the code says, you do the calcs, you'll never make it, you'll never get there, unless that charger is part of a system that is monitoring the service conductors and can either, a very simple one, in fact you can see, I think Savant's a company that does this, they'll actually can turn off an EV charger directly or ramp it down, or in the case of Franklin, they have a smart circuit, and so if you put your EV charger on the smart circuit, it gets over a certain point, you just cut it off. That's kind of the brute force method. You know, obviously you'd like a system that would communicate with the car and make sure, okay, I can charge full current 32 amps right now, but the AC just came on. Okay, now I got to back off to, because there's other stuff going on, people are using their electric range or whatever, I got to back off to 16 amps for a while. Okay, fine. Unless you're like, I got to have it now kind of thing, you know, it's not a big deal to ramp your EV down. And so control, either on-off control or ramping control, it now makes these things a lot more useful. The same it can be said on the other side for PV and energy storage. So how would power control systems come along with energy storage? Well, I said I'm on a 100 amp service. I could literally put 200 amps of PV on a 100 amp service if it's power controlled. There's no limitation on the load side, as long as it's power controlled. Now, it would be probably not work very well if I put that big of a PV system on a 100 amp service, because I'd be really challenged to find the loads to suck up that extra power. I'd be in curtailment mode a lot. But what we're saying is technically it's fine, and safety-wise it's fine. Okay? So the code would not allow you to do this before, and it does now. There you go. So there's lots of different ways of doing this, but that's power control systems. This is out of an article I wrote for the International Association of Electrical Inspectors, April-May issue of 2020. So you can look that up online and take a look at that. I'm getting ready to release a new article for the same magazine in November, December, talking about MIDs and meter collar adapters. Meter collar adapters is another really cool area. You can talk to the connector guys way on the other side, but they have the ability to plug in an electric vehicle charger into your main meter that also measures the main service. And now you can put, again, on a 100 amp service, you can put it an electric vehicle charger, which you couldn't have done before. So there's lots of different really neat applications coming down the road. But in this case, if we're using something like a Franklin unit, then we want to get away from that main power and come downstream. And again, once we come out of this with a 100 amp breaker, we can have loads and supply in there. If we go into an energy management system, the sky's the limit. Do whatever you want. It now becomes a situation of can you justify as much solar as you can? And so the way to think about this, and this is what I talk about in that article a year and a half ago, think about the utility no longer as your only source of supply, certainly not that, or even your main source of supply. Think of it, a 100 amp service as a 19 kilowatt full time. You can run 19 kilowatts through a 100 amp service 24/7. If you could run 19 kilowatts through a service 24/7, first of all, you couldn't afford your electric bill in California. That would be on a 100 amp service. You literally could not afford your electric bill. But let's just say you use a little bit of that. You can charge your battery with it, things like that, and you can source power back out of it. That 100 amp connection is way bigger than we've been taught to think it is. We think of a 100 amp service as being a really small service. And the answer is, once you start applying these other technologies, PV and energy storage, to that 100 amp service, it looks way better than a 100 amp service. I actually have run my house, 4,000 square foot house, on a 100 amp service for 2 years. Never had a problem. So it's totally possible. And so it does depend on how you control your loads, how you control the system. So so I can answer some questions. We got a few minutes left, but I just wanted to make sure that in the field, I run into a lot of folks that just don't understand these things. Again, they have a hammer that says 120% rule on it, and they're banging things, or they have their hammer that says, you know, supply side connection, and those things just will not work anymore in this world. Got to have other tools. Thanks, everybody, and I'll be hanging around here if you want to chat, and have a great rest of your show.